Hello, class. Let's talk about World War I and how it all fits together with our story of American history. So, we all know that World War I left the world devastated. Europe was a wreck, the economies across the globe were fallen and broken, and even here in the United States, we fell into a Great Depression after the era of the Roaring Twenties and unrestricted capitalism. We already know that Franklin Roosevelt came to power in the United States, but at the same time, Roosevelt was coming to power in the US to manage the Great Depression. Dictators were rising to power in other parts of the world. So let's take a look at what led to one of the greatest conflicts in world history and the event that made America the world superpower for the rest of the 20th century. When we consider the causes of World War II, there are three main features to consider. The first would be the end of World War I. Some argue that the most important factor in the cause of World War II is the devastation left behind by World War I. Nothing was gained from World War I, and many countries of the world went into a period of isolation as a result of the horrors of the conflict. The great treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that was managed by our own president, Woodrow Wilson, is one of the main causes of World War II. Because of how severely the treaty punished the losers of World War I, including and most importantly Germany, the country was ripe for the takeover of anyone who could come and promise to fix all of the devastation after World War I. And that leads to the second cause of World War II, the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and Benito Mussolini in Italy. Both countries had been devastated by World War I, their economies were in a free fall, and Hitler and Mussolini came to power promising to fix those devastating consequences of the war. But while all this is happening in Europe, and while the Depression is racking America, in Japan, imperial power is growing, and Emperor Hirohito has come to power, threatening to attack his neighbors and become more powerful in the Pacific. So when we think about these three leaders, Benito Mussolini in the top left, Adolf Hitler on the top right, and Emperor Hirohito at the bottom, these three dictators will cause the devastating havoc of World War II. When we think about Hitler's rise to power in Europe, we can see how Germany and Czechoslovakia, what was Austria-Hungary, and even Italy will unite together to become known as the Axis powers. But, as always, Germany has a disadvantage geographically in fighting any kind of conflict in Europe, and that is they are in the center of the continent. But Hitler will begin a slow and steady rebuilding of German power. He will rebuild the German military, violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He will slowly start to take control of small territories adjacent to Germany. He will make alliances with Benito Mussolini in Italy and eventually the peaceful takeover of Czechoslovakia. In what is known as the Anschluss, Germany will slowly begin bullying their neighbors into capitulation. And the rest of the world does nothing in response. As Hitler rises to power, the world ignores him, hoping that he will stop, hoping that he will not continue his aggressive actions. And of course, this just emboldens Hitler. The rest of Europe warns Hitler, tells him not to continue, but ultimately, Europe and the rest of the world, including the United States, do nothing because all are busy handling their own devastated economies and internal political consequences. In 1938 to 1939, the period known as appeasement will attempt to mollify Hitler, to encourage him to stop. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, will go to Hitler and negotiate what's known as the Munich Accords, or the Munich Agreement. And in 1938, Hitler agrees that he will stop at Czechoslovakia, that he promises not to take any more territory. Neville Chamberlain goes back to Britain and is greeted as a hero because he prevents another war. But anyone that could look forward, anybody that could have seen Hitler's aggressive nature, would understand that he had far grander plans than just stopping at Czechoslovakia. Hitler slowly but surely continued his occupation of territories, from the occupied Rhineland in 1936 to annexing Austria in 1938 to the Sudetenland in 1938, and then Bohemia and Moravia, and eventually his annexation of Czech territory. It was very clear that Hitler's thirst for power in taking over Europe was not going to stop. And his plan with this Axis powers, the Axis being right in the center of Europe, was to continue this aggressive march until Germany was able to take all of mainland Europe. Remember, Hitler had promised to stop at Czechoslovakia, and he had made a peace agreement with the United Kingdom, with Great Britain, not to continue any aggressive moves. But of course, Hitler violates this treaty, and as soon as March of 1939, after Hitler has taken Czechoslovakia, and in August of 1939 reveals the secret German-Soviet non-aggression pact, where the Soviet Union agrees not to go into conflict with Hitler, Germany, on September 1st, 1939, invades Poland. And that invasion of Poland will then trigger the beginning of World War II, because now Britain and France have no choice but to declare war on the German government. So from Hitler's slow, steady rise and his slow accumulation of power in Europe, when nobody stopped him, month after month, year after year, they kept trying to appease Hitler, to prevent another war, to stop him from gaining too much power. But by September 1st of 1939, when Hitler invades Poland and reveals his secret agreement with the Soviet Union to keep them out of the war, he now has Europe in the palm of his hand. And because he doesn't have to fight a two-front war, Hitler now has every opportunity to crush France and Great Britain and take control of all of Europe. One method of his warfare, which was known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was the quickness with which he was able to attack his enemy. So from his armored tanks, the Panzer tanks, his planes, his concentrated attacks, he's going to very quickly move on France. And by June of 1940, he's already taken most of France, including the city of Paris. So now Hitler controls all of mainland Europe. And if you look at this map, you can see just how much he now controls. From Poland in the far east to France in the far west, and his allies with Italy and Hungary and Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, he controls all of mainland Europe. The only thing standing in the way of his total victory is now Great Britain. Luckily for the world, in the early days of 1940, a new prime minister is elected in Great Britain. And that new prime minister, Winston Churchill, will lead his country in one of the most influential and important battles of the entire war, another key moment. And that key moment is known as the Battle of Britain. From June to September of 1940, Hitler decides that the best way to take Britain, because it's an island, is to bomb them into submission. So he begins a concentrated bombing campaign to destroy Great Britain and force them to surrender. That way he won't have to send troops ashore on the island, losing hundreds of thousands of men. Instead, he can destroy civilian targets and force the British to surrender. But the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, refuses to surrender, and he stirs passion in the people of his country using the radio to encourage their resistance. He tells the people of Great Britain and the world that Britain will never surrender. They will fight on the beaches, they will fight on the streets, they will fight in the skies, they will fight on the land, but they will never surrender to the Germans. The British also have an advantage with a small fighter plane called the Spitfire. And they've also invented one of the most impactful inventions of the war, radar. So they know when the German Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, is coming. And they can warn people with air sirens and air raid warnings to prevent people from taking too many casualties. The leader of the German Luftwaffe, Goering, has really no clear strategy, and he's not really sure whether to go after the Royal Air Force or target civilians. And so the Battle of Britain does not go the way Hitler wants. From June until September, the British refuse to surrender, and Hitler becomes very frustrated. As a result, he decides if he can't take Britain, he'll go after the one remaining power in Europe, the power that he had encouraged to stay out of the war at the beginning. And now Hitler turns his attention to the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR. So Hitler now attacks the Soviet Union. He invades the Soviets, tries to take Moscow, tries to take Stalingrad. And in 1941, he moves very quickly on the Soviets. And it looks like he's going to easily take them. But resistance in Stalingrad coincides with one of the most impactful moments of the entire war. And Hitler's mistake in now attacking the Soviets is going to be compounded by the events of December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bomb American ships in Pearl Harbor. As Japan had been moving steadily outward from their island in the Pacific, they see American forces and American naval force as the one thing that can stop their continued growth and power. And so they decide to try to destroy that power by kamikaze bombing on the naval station at Pearl Harbor, which at the time in Hawaii was an American territory. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor and sink several ships in the harbor, destroying most of the U.S. Navy and over 2,000 sailors on that Sunday afternoon. Of course, this now brings America into the war, a country that had stayed out because of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt, now in 1941, is forced to bring America into the war because of this attack. And the United States will declare war on Japan and then on Germany and Italy. And this key moment will now create for Hitler a two-front war, the two-front war that he most wanted to avoid. The United States will very quickly make a comeback in the Pacific against the Japanese. And the next summer, in June of 1942, the United States at the nearby island of Midway will turn the tides on the Japanese, tricking them, gathering many of their naval forces in that region, and dropping bombs from planes overhead to destroy a large section of the Japanese forces. Now, from June of 1942, the United States are going to continually be pushing the Japanese back further and further and further toward the island of Japan. Meanwhile, in Europe, American forces are doing everything they can to try to force Hitler back. But in order to do that, they have to come ashore on mainland Europe. Because remember, Hitler controls the entire continent. So the United States and the Soviet Union work together. The Soviet Union attacks from the east, coming through Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary to try to push the Germans back into Germany. The United States, meanwhile, comes through North Africa into Italy and begins destroying Italian forces, forcing them back. So from 1941 to 1944, Hitler is on the retreat. Mussolini is actually deposed in Italy and removed from power, and Italy drops out of the war. But the United States has still not come ashore in mainland France. They've been planning since 1941. So all of 1942, all of 1943, the general in charge of American forces in Europe, Dwight David Eisenhower, is planning a massive assault on the beaches of France to drive back the German forces once and for all. And on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the bloodiest day in American history, and another one of the key moments of the war, the United States and our allies in Great Britain and Canada will attack on the beaches of Normandy and drive back the German forces in the largest amphibious assault in the history of the world. You can just see from this picture the number of tanks and boats and planes and blimps that came ashore on the beaches of Normandy to drive back the German forces. Now, from 1944 until 1945, it's just a matter of time as the United States and the Soviet Union begin to push Germany back, to crush the Germans and force them back into Germany. So after D-Day, within 1 month, there are 1 million Allied forces stationed throughout Europe. Germany is surrounded with the USSR to the east and the United States and Great Britain in the west. And in 1945, Hitler will commit suicide, dropping Germany out of the war in what is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. But the war in the Pacific still goes on. The Japanese refuse to surrender, and the United States is forced to continue to push back the Japanese forces. And in many ways, what is considered the D-Day of the Pacific, the Battle of Iwo Jima, the United States takes the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima and plants the American flag atop Mount Suribachi in what becomes one of the most symbolic images of the 20th century, with these men raising the American flag and driving the Japanese off the island of Iwo Jima. From that point forward, it's just a matter of time. From that key moment in 1945, it's just a matter of how long will it be until the Japanese are forced to surrender. Franklin Roosevelt has already died. He dies a few days before Adolf Hitler. He never actually sees the end of the war in Europe because he dies of a brain embolism. And as we've discussed in class, Harry S. Truman, the Vice President of the United States, becomes the president. And now he has to decide, how do we end this war in Japan? How do we end this war in the Pacific? And he will make the momentous decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. 2 bombs of unbelievably devastating power. And on August 6, 1945, the United States reveals, in this key moment of the war, this enormously devastating power that they now have, becoming really the only atomic superpower in the world at that time. The war is now over. Germany has been destroyed and surrendered. Japan now surrenders after the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we're now entering a new world, the world of post-World War II. And that new world very much has come to America as part of this war effort. Throughout the war, as we saw in World War I, and even more than we saw in World War I, women are called upon to do the work of men in factories all across America. Without women working in these factories, like this famous image of Rosie the Riveter, building American ships and planes and uniforms and guns, the United States would never have been successful. Also similar to World War I, black soldiers throughout the war will make an enormous difference. And of course, when they come back from that war, they're going to demand the kinds of freedoms that they sacrificed in Europe and in the Pacific. And unfortunately, here in the United States, one of the most impactful decisions of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency is when the war breaks out, when Japanese bombs fall on Pearl Harbor, the United States decides to incarcerate all Japanese Americans in internment camps across the country. And these are people who were born in the United States or had become citizens of the United States. They're not given trials, they're not given lawyers, they're not given constitutional rights. And it's very important to consider the contradiction that these Japanese internment camps, like the one that Fred Korematsu was placed into have an impact on American history. So let's consider the overall losses of the wartime powers in World War II. Germany loses 4.5 million soldiers and 2 million civilians. The Japanese, 2 million soldiers and 350,000 civilians. The United States loses 274,000 soldiers, but upwards of 400,000 total casualties, over 400,000 Gold Star families in the United States. Look at the devastation of this war. The Soviet Union loses over 10 million people. China loses 7.4 million civilians, in addition to 2.5 million soldiers in battling Japan. The war is devastating to the world. But unlike other wars, unlike the wars that we've seen before, this time the war ends with the United States securing a United Nations to prevent these kinds of conflicts from happening in the future. I hope this gives you a good overview of World War II and the impact that it had both on the world and on the United States.